Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Scrying Mirror. I wanted to talk to you about funerals in the Victorian era and what happened to them and what actually really did go down after a certain amount of time of the centuries of them being in parlors in their homes. So it started out as the Victorians using, as the Roman Greeks did, the tear catchers, which tear catchers were one of the top things that they used. The tear catcher was something that they could give when they showed so much of their tears. That meant that they mourned over that person that much, and they would give it to the deceased family, put it in the casket, or keep it. And it got so crazily popular that they would even buy them and decorate them themselves, putting gold gild on them or ordering them with gold inlay in them. And that's also what they did with actually hair as well. But the tear catchers are something that you hardly can find these days. And they were elaborate tear catchers. I mean, insane. But then there comes the human hair funeral art. The human hair funeral art it was made with like a decorative tree like this, made into a decorative tree like that. That was where the human hair was turned into a tree with decorative foliage, human hair preserved under glass with an inscription at the center. And this was mid 1800s. So, as early as the 1400s in Europe, creating hair art is to memorize the dead began especially because epidemic and plagues took such a high toll on children. Beginning in the 1600s, the Swedish began plaiting hair as decorative folk art, and that tradition was carried on among Scandinavian pioneers in the America. In the 1800s, as well as centuries before, a woman's hair was her glory, and it was held in high esteem in other ways, cropped from dead loved ones to make memorial wreaths, hair trees, brooches, bracelets, and other adornments, such as a piece of their loved ones would remain with the living beyond the grave and death. It may seem macabre to us today, but it wasn't. People would use human hair and silk mourning sample, like the one I showed in the video. That was a piece of silk with human hair sewn into it. So Victorians, and especially pioneers brave the frontier, were intimately acquainted with death. By some estates, 1 out of 10 pioneers died on the Oregon Trail going west, and child mortality rate in 1850 was nearly 1 in 5. So when family members died, the family bathed and dressed the bodies and often laid them out on the kitchen table or in the parlor. Death photography was common and often the only photograph of the deceased a family had, because back then it was very, very expensive. Hair was cherished, and most every Victorian woman grew up learning needle arts. So it was so odd that a loved one, usually a woman, would crop hair from their. It wouldn't be unusual. This basic emotional impulse blossomed into a spectacular decorative art in the 1800s, but glorifying a lost loved one. There's a brooch here that I showed in one of the videos with their hair braided. Queen Victoria, when she did hers, she gave pieces of jewelry made from her hair as gifts to her children and grandchildren as well as friends. Napoleon famously wore his watch on a chain fob made from hair of his wife, Empress Marie Louise. But the practice became popular among poor and immigrant pioneers too, since many died with few worldly possessions but the shirt on their back and their hair on the head. And what better memento for thought though flesh rots to bone than nothing, hair holds its form. But by the mid-1800s, hair art was considered an elegant accomplishment, and fashions were worn in the hair. After that, it started to become popular for other things, such as teeth. And so teeth were also enamels, so they would use enameled in rings. They would use it in many other things as well. But most of the time it was very much teeth, like the enamel they used. They actually put it in their their rings, their earrings, their necklaces, things like that. But the main thing that I thought was curious was the early funeral practices in America was the death, where Puritan funerals were silent, somber affairs. Their wakes were lively communal events. The night before the burial, friends and family of the deceased gathered at the house of mourning to partake in a viewing or of time of watching over the body. And this was to make sure that the deceased did not awaken. The wake was accompanied by a large feast where mourners celebrated with food and liquor. That's why it's called a wake. Because back then, they really didn't have the best way to tell if they were dead or not. So for 3 days after the death, they would watch them to make sure they didn't wake, like if they awoke or anything like that. So they had that time period. The wake was accompanied by a large feast, and mourners celebrated with food and liquor. Their rum bill was often the most lavish expense of the entire funeral. As the population of the colonies grew, their funeral ceremonies became increasingly elaborate. Public displays of mourning. The exchange of gifts became a major part of colonial death rituals, the most common being pairs of gloves and golden rings that were distributed to attendees. So these were like party favors given to the deceased at funerals. You would get a ring for attending one, or one of those tear catchers to put your tears in. And if you wanted to give it back to them, or save it, or put it in the casket, that was up to you. So they distributed these to all the attendees that came. They were even given pairs of gloves, and most of these were those white gloves. At the funeral of the Waitsel Winthrop, the grandson of the founding governor of Massachusetts, 60 rings were given to friends in attendance. The total expense of the entire ceremony was over £600, which amounts to 1/5 of Winthrop's entire estate. It says in a year, Boston and them calculated it up, an academic expert of colonial history. They thought that if they were spending so much money on all these funerals, they could be paying property taxes or other taxes. So instead, the increasing grandeur of funeral ceremonies became a financial burden for some communities, particularly the widows and children who become impoverished by spending the estate on funeral bills. But legislators began to pass sumptuary laws to regulate extravagant funeral purchases. This restricted the amount of money they could be charged for things like mourning garments, the tolling of the church bell, and undertaker services. So what happened is, before that, they told them that they would give them a fine, or what was it? They would give them a fine. Let's see. And if they if they spent too much on the funeral, the penalty of £50 was forfeited by the executor to the will of the estate of the person entered, to be recovered by action. So no scarves, gloves, except 6 pair to the bearers, and 1 pair to each minister of the church or congregation where any deceased person belongs. Wine, rum, or rings shall be allowed and given at any funeral upon the penalty of £50. So everybody couldn't even do any of these things for their funerals anymore. So guess what happened? People started opening funeral parlors where they could start embalming. After they seen Lincoln being embalmed and going around the entire state, being visited when he went on that carriage ride all the way around so everybody could see him when he passed away, when he was executed, they were like, okay, wow, this embalming is really cool. That was the first time they had seen an embalmed person. So after this, funeral parlors started opening, and they started calling them undertakers. So they started getting things like the 19th century, it was considered to be the genesis of the modern American funeral industry. Towns grew into cities, which quickly became severely overcrowded. As local cemeteries ran out of burial space, the Rural Park Cemetery emerged, located far enough away from the city to require transportation. There were coffin makers, carriage rentals, hearse transportations on the carriages. So over time, these coffin makers began to take on other duties like death care. They offered mourning wear, burial clothes, flowers, preparation of the body, and coordination of the entire funeral service. So I thought I'd give you all a little in-depth thing on funerals and how they were in the Victorian era.